Cops arrested a black man at gas station. Next day, he's the judge presiding over their hearing. It was an ordinary morning for Jason, a man in his early 30s who lived in the quiet neighborhood just a few miles outside the city. Jason had always prided himself on being a hard-working, law-abiding citizen. He wasn't one for drama, always keeping his head down and focusing on his job. As a small business owner, Jason's day typically started early, around 7 a.m., when he would grab a cup of coffee and head out to the local gas station to fill up his car before running errands. This routine had become as familiar as his morning shower. He enjoyed the peacefulness of those early hours, when the world was still waking up. Jason had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary on this particular day. He pulled into the gas station, just as he had countless times before, and parked beside one of the pumps. The air was still cool, and the station was nearly empty, with just a couple of cars scattered around. As he stepped out of his car and walked over to the pump, he noticed the sound of a police car pulling up behind him. It wasn't unusual to see a patrol car in this area, but something about the situation felt different. The officer who stepped out of the car was a tall, broad-shouldered man. He wore the standard dark blue uniform with the badge shining on his chest. Jason wasn't sure if the officer had noticed him before or if it was just a coincidence, but the officer's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Jason, ever calm, didn't think much of it at first. He focused on pumping his gas, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The officer approached him slowly, his footsteps quiet against the pavement. "Excuse me, sir," the officer called out, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tone that made Jason pause. Jason turned to face the officer, offering a polite nod. "Can I help you, officer?" The officer didn't smile. Instead, he stepped closer, looking Jason up and down with a careful eye. "You know, you fit the description of someone we've been looking for," he said, his voice not quite accusatory but still firm. Jason blinked, momentarily confused. "Description?" he repeated, unsure of what the officer meant. The officer nodded, pointing toward a nearby street. "There was a report about a man matching your description involved in a disturbance earlier today. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Jason shook his head, feeling a sense of unease wash over him. "I've just been here to fill up my car. I don't know anything about any disturbance." The officer's expression remained unchanged. "Are you sure about that? You wouldn't mind if we ran your ID, would you?" Jason felt a twinge of irritation. He had done nothing wrong, and now it seemed like the officer was questioning his integrity, but he knew better than to escalate things. "Of course, officer," he said, trying to remain calm, "but I assure you I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached for his radio, speaking into it for a moment, as if to confirm something. Jason's heart began to race slightly. He was starting to get the distinct feeling that this was not just a casual conversation. Why was the officer still treating him like a suspect? A few minutes passed, though it felt much longer as the officer seemed to wait for something. Jason stood there, unsure of what was going to happen next. The situation was beginning to feel surreal. All he wanted to do was finish getting gas and go about his day. The officer finally looked back at Jason, his expression still unreadable. "Step out of the car, please." Jason froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden change in tone. "What? Why?" "I haven't done anything wrong." "We'll figure that out after you step out of the car, sir," the officer said, his voice growing colder. A second officer, who had been sitting in the patrol car, got out and joined the first officer. Jason felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, it seemed. The officers were no longer asking him questions. They were now treating him like someone they had already decided was guilty of something. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the car now," the second officer said, his hand resting on his belt. Jason's mind raced. He knew that any movement or wrong word could make things worse. He had seen the news, heard the stories of others who had been treated unfairly by law enforcement. But he also knew that he had to remain calm, that he couldn't let the situation spiral out of control. Reluctantly, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. The officers immediately moved closer, surrounding him with their presence. The first officer reached for his handcuffs, and Jason could feel his stomach drop. "Wait, what are you doing?" Jason asked, his voice rising slightly, but not in anger, just in sheer confusion. "You're being detained for questioning," the first officer said, his voice clipped. "We're going to take you in for further investigation." Jason couldn't believe what he was hearing. Detained? For what? There had to be some mistake. "I'm not the person you're looking for," he protested. But it didn't matter. The officers weren't listening. They didn't seem to care about his protests. In a matter of moments, they had placed the cold handcuffs around his wrists and led him to the patrol car. Jason's mind was spinning, and a sense of helplessness washed over him. He had never been arrested before. He had never even been in trouble with the law. How could this be happening? As they drove to the police station, Jason tried to make sense of it all. He had been polite, calm, and cooperative. He hadn't given them any reason to treat him like this. And yet here he was, detained on his way to the station, accused of something he had no idea about. The drive felt like an eternity. The car's lights flashed outside, casting a dim, orange glow over the road. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being targeted for something beyond his control. The officers never spoke to him again during the ride. There was nothing to say, it seemed. They had made up their minds. At the police station, Jason was placed in a holding cell. The room was cold, and the sound of other prisoners murmuring in the background only added to his growing sense of isolation. He sat there, his thoughts racing, wondering how his day had gone so horribly wrong. What had started as a simple trip to the gas station had turned into something far more complicated and terrifying. Jason's mind kept coming back to one thought. Why him? Why had he been singled out? Was it the color of his skin? Was that really all it took for him to become a suspect in someone else's story? He tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He knew that he had to stay strong. He had to stay calm. But as he sat there, handcuffed and alone, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would anyone believe his side of the story? Would anyone care? The next morning, Jason awoke in a small, uncomfortable bed in the holding cell. The room was dim, and the sterile white walls made everything feel cold and distant. His mind was still racing, replaying the events from the day before like a broken record. He couldn't quite process what had happened, how a simple visit to the gas station had turned into a nightmare. He had been arrested, placed in a holding cell, and left to wonder about the consequences of this day. What if this was just the beginning? What if this moment changed everything? The early morning light filtered through a small window above his bed, and Jason squinted against the brightness. The sounds of other prisoners echoed through the walls, but his mind was far away, focused only on his situation. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't some dangerous suspect. He was just a man trying to live his life, and yet here he was, locked away in a jail cell, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. A few hours later, an officer came to his cell and unlocked the door. "Time to go," the officer said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jason stood up, his legs stiff from the long night on the hard mattress, and walked out of the cell. The officer led him down the narrow hallway of the police station to a small waiting room. Jason sat in a chair, his hands still cuffed, feeling like he was just another faceless individual caught in the system. He had been through so many steps already, being arrested, placed in a cell, but he had no idea what the next part of the process would be. What would happen now? Was this just the beginning of a long, drawn-out fight that he couldn't control? Minutes turned into hours, and Jason began to lose track of time. He couldn't help but wonder if anyone had even bothered to listen to his side of the story. The officers hadn't asked him any meaningful questions yesterday, and they certainly hadn't offered him any explanation as to why he was being detained. He had told them he had nothing to do with the disturbance they were looking for, but it seemed as though that didn't matter. They had already made their decision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an officer entered the room and gestured for Jason to follow him. Jason stood up and walked with the officer through the station, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. They passed by a few rooms with officers at their desks, but no one seemed to pay him much attention. He was just another person in the system, nothing special, just a number to be processed. The officer stopped at a door and knocked. "Come in," a voice called from the other side. Jason was led into a small, plain room with a long wooden table in the center. Behind the table sat a man in a black robe, his face stern and serious. The man was a judge, but to Jason, he looked like just another person who had the power to decide his fate. The judge looked up as Jason entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of the man who had been arrested the day before. "Sit down," the judge instructed. Jason did as he was told, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and now here he was, sitting in front of a judge who seemed to be sizing him up like an animal in a cage. "Do you know why you're here?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. Jason shook his head, trying to maintain his composure. "No, Your Honor, I don't know what I'm being accused of." The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at some papers in front of him, reading through something Jason couldn't see. Jason sat in silence, waiting for some kind of explanation, but it never came. He could feel the tension rising in the room, a palpable sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. The door opened again, and two officers entered the room. They were the same two officers who had arrested Jason the day before. Jason's stomach tightened as he saw them again. He had hoped to avoid them, but now here they were, standing before him as the judge presided over their hearing. It felt surreal. The men who had wrongfully detained him were now the ones being questioned. "Your Honor," one of the officers began, speaking respectfully, "we've come to present our case." The judge nodded, gesturing for the officers to proceed. Jason felt his heart race as the officers started talking. They were explaining the situation from their point of view, describing how they had approached Jason at the gas station and why they had felt justified in detaining him. They spoke with authority, as if they had done nothing wrong, as if everything they had done was completely within their rights. But Jason knew the truth. He had been treated unfairly. He had been singled out, judged by the color of his skin before he had even been given a chance to explain himself. He listened to the officer's testimony, trying to stay calm, but a burning frustration began to build inside of him. The judge listened carefully to the officers, nodding along occasionally, but Jason could tell that he was skeptical. There was something in the way the judge's eyes flicked between the two officers, something that made Jason feel like there was a chance for justice. Maybe this wasn't going to be as bad as he feared. When the officers finished speaking, the judge turned his attention to Jason. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked. Jason swallowed hard, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. "Your Honor, I was just trying to fill up my car. I didn't do anything wrong. The officers stopped me and they didn't even give me a chance to explain. I wasn't involved in any disturbance. I just wanted to go about my day." The judge didn't interrupt. He simply listened as Jason explained his side of the story, detailing the way the officers had treated him and how he had been confused and shocked by the entire encounter. Jason's words were clear, and he spoke from the heart. He didn't try to make excuses. He just told the truth, hoping that someone would believe him. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he processed what Jason had said. Jason could feel the tension in the room, but he remained calm, waiting for the judge's decision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up and spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Adams," he said, addressing Jason by his last name. "I will take your testimony into account along with the officer's statements. We will reconvene in the morning for the final decision." Jason nodded, his heart still racing. He had done everything he could. Now it was in the judge's hands. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly as he walked out of the room, the officers following behind him. The weight of the situation still pressed heavily on his chest, but for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for justice. As he left the courtroom, Jason couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the judge believe him? Would he be able to go back to his life, to move past this moment? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger, something that would change everything for him? The officers walked ahead of him, their faces still stoic, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. He wasn't just a man arrested at a gas station anymore. He was someone with a voice, someone who had stood up for himself in a system that had tried to silence him. The next day, Jason couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. It had been a long, restless night. The anxiety of not knowing what the next step would be had kept him awake far longer than he cared to admit. As he sat in his small apartment, waiting for the moment when he would return to the courthouse, his mind continued to churn over what had happened and what was to come. The day before had felt like a dream, like an out-of-body experience. Jason never imagined he would find himself in such a situation. Yet here he was, facing the two officers who had wrongfully detained him. Now, as the hearing loomed ahead, he found himself feeling a strange mixture of determination and fear. What if the judge didn't believe him? What if the officers walked away with no consequences? He had witnessed so many stories of injustice before, and it seemed like things rarely changed. But then again, something about this felt different. Jason had spoken up, he had told the truth, and he had seen the judge's skepticism as the officers made their case. That small glimmer of hope stayed with him. The judge had listened. That was more than he could say for so many others who had been in his position. The courthouse buzzed with activity as Jason made his way to the courtroom. The feeling of anticipation filled the air, as it always did before a big decision, but this time it felt heavier. Jason wasn't just a bystander. He wasn't just someone sitting in the back of the room, waiting for his case to be called. This time he was walking into a room where the outcome would be in his hands. The officers had already arrived. Their uniforms looked crisp, their posture perfect, but Jason could see the unease in their eyes. They were trying to maintain their composure, but the tension was undeniable. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to being questioned, to being held accountable for their actions. And yet, here they were, standing before the very person they had treated so unfairly. Jason took his seat, his eyes briefly meeting theirs. It wasn't a look of anger, not really. It was more a look of resolve. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just focused. Focused on the truth and on making sure that justice was done. The judge walked into the room, his robes flowing as he moved to the bench. The room fell silent. Jason could feel the weight of the judge's presence, the authority that came with the position, but he also knew that the judge wasn't just any figurehead. He was a person who had seen it all, someone who knew how the system could fail, and someone who might just be the one to make a difference. "Court is now in session," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "We are here to review the incident that occurred yesterday, involving the arrest of Mr. Jason Adams at the local gas station. Mr. Adams, you will have the opportunity to present your case, and the officers will be allowed to explain their actions." Jason nodded silently, the familiar sting of being scrutinized returning. He was the one on trial now, not in the legal sense, but in the court of public opinion. The officers had made their case the day before, explaining why they had detained him. But now it was his turn to speak, and he intended to do so with clarity. The judge gestured for him to stand, and Jason did, his heart pounding. He was ready, but there was still that sliver of doubt in his mind. Would the judge see things the way he did? Would he recognize the injustice that had taken place? "Your Honor," Jason began, his voice steady but calm, "I was at the gas station yesterday just like any other day. I was getting gas when I was approached by the officers. They said I matched the description of someone involved in a disturbance. I was confused. I didn't know what they were talking about. I hadn't done anything wrong." He paused for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. It wasn't easy to recount such a difficult experience, but he had to. The truth was all he had. "I told them that I wasn't involved in anything," he continued. "But instead of listening, they treated me like I was already guilty. They didn't ask me any questions, they didn't give me a chance to explain. They just arrested me. They didn't care about my side of the story." Jason could feel the eyes of the room on him. He wasn't sure if the officers were looking at him or if the judge was taking in every word. But he didn't care. He had to say what needed to be said. "I don't know why I was singled out. I don't know if it was because of the color of my skin or if it was something else. But I do know that I didn't deserve to be treated that way. I didn't deserve to be arrested for nothing." The room was silent for a moment. Jason could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about his personal experience anymore. This was about something larger. It was about fairness, about the need for change in a system that had too often failed people like him. The judge looked down at his notes, then up at Jason. "Thank you, Mr. Adams," he said, his voice measured. "You've presented your side of the story. Now we will hear from the officers." The two officers, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward. They looked at each other for a brief moment before turning to face the judge. Jason watched them closely, noting the subtle tension in their posture. They weren't as confident as they had been the day before. They were being asked to justify their actions, and it wasn't something they were used to. The first officer spoke. "Your Honor, we were simply doing our jobs. We received a report about a disturbance in the area. Mr. Adams matched the description given to us by a witness. We approached him to ask some questions, and when he became agitated, we felt it was necessary to detain him for further questioning. Jason couldn't help but shake his head. "I wasn't agitated," he muttered under his breath, but he quickly silenced himself, realizing it wasn't the time to interrupt. The second officer continued, "We didn't know the full story at the time. We just did what we thought was necessary to ensure the safety of everyone involved." Jason's patience wore thin. The officers weren't taking responsibility for what had happened. They weren't acknowledging the fact that they had acted in haste, that they had ignored his rights in the process. But he knew he couldn't let frustration get the better of him. He had to stay focused. The judge listened carefully, taking notes as the officers spoke. Then, after a brief silence, he turned his attention back to Jason. "Mr. Adams," he said, "this court will take all the information presented here into account. I will deliberate on this matter and give my final decision in due course." Jason sat back down, his heart still racing but his mind clearer than it had been the day before. He had spoken the truth. He had stood his ground. Now it was up to the judge to decide what would happen next. The officers were dismissed, and the judge began to gather his papers, preparing for the next case. Jason felt the eyes of the room on him, but this time it didn't bother him. He had done what he needed to do. For the first time, he felt like he had a voice that mattered. As he walked out of the courtroom, Jason took a deep breath. The next step was still unknown, but for the first time since the arrest, he felt a sense of peace. He had done everything he could. And now, no matter what happened, he knew he had made a difference. Jason walked out of the courthouse, his head a little higher than it had been when he entered. The courtroom was still fresh in his mind, the tension hanging in the air, but there was something different now. He wasn't just a man who had been arrested and wrongfully treated. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was someone who had stood up for himself, someone who had made his voice heard. As he stepped into the fresh air outside the courthouse, the world felt a little bit different. It wasn't just the sunlight or the gentle breeze. It was the feeling that he had done something right. The officers had made their case and he had made his. But what mattered now was what would come next. What would the judge decide? Jason knew that the decision was in the judge's hands, and that was something he couldn't control. He had done everything he could to present the truth. He had stayed calm. He had shown restraint. Now all he could do was wait and hope. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation begin to lift just slightly. It was as though he had carried the burden of this incident for so long, and now he could at least let some of it go, if only for a moment. The streets were busier now than they had been when he had arrived. The usual hum of the city surrounded him. Cars passed by, people walked on the sidewalks, and it seemed as if the world had never stopped moving, despite everything that had happened. Jason didn't head straight home. Instead, he walked a few blocks, his thoughts spinning. He needed to clear his head. He found a small park and sat on a bench, watching the people around him. Children were running and laughing, people were walking their dogs, and the sun was shining brightly above. It was a peaceful scene, and it reminded him of everything he had been fighting for, not just for himself, but for a better future, one where people like him wouldn't have to fear being wrongfully treated by the system. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his lawyer. It was short but to the point. "The judge will give his decision this afternoon. Be ready." Jason exhaled slowly, his chest tightening again. The waiting game was always the hardest part. He had spent most of his life staying out of trouble, doing his best to follow the rules. But now, as he sat there, waiting for the decision to be made, he couldn't help but think about how often people like him had been unfairly targeted. How many times had others faced what he was facing right now? How many had not had the chance to fight back? The thought gave him pause. What if he didn't get the justice he was hoping for? What if the officers were let off with just a slap on the wrist? He shook his head, not wanting to think about it. He couldn't afford to think that way. He had to believe that the judge would make the right call. As he stood up to stretch his legs, Jason noticed a couple of people passing by. They were a young couple, laughing and talking as they strolled along the path. Jason smiled to himself. It was moments like this that reminded him why he couldn't give up. The world could be so much better, so much fairer if people took the time to really understand one another. An hour later, Jason's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time, it was a call from his lawyer. Jason hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello," he said, his voice tight. "Jason," his lawyer's voice came through, calm but serious. "The judge has reached a decision." Jason's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment. "I'm heading over to the courthouse now. You should come back too." The judge has made a ruling. Jason didn't need any more explanation. He thanked his lawyer quickly and hung up the phone. The brief moment of peace he had felt in the park evaporated, replaced by the familiar anxiety that had plagued him since yesterday. But this time it was different. He had already made his case. Now it was in the hands of someone who had the power to make things right. He took the same route back to the courthouse, his pace quickening as he approached the building. His thoughts raced through his mind again, recalling everything he had said, everything the officers had said, and everything the judge had asked. He had been clear, he had been honest, and he had been calm. He had hoped that would be enough. When Jason entered the courtroom again, he was surprised to see that the room was less crowded than the day before. The officers had already arrived, their faces as unreadable as ever. The judge's seat was empty for a moment as everyone waited for him to enter. And then the door opened. The judge walked into the room, his black robe flowing behind him, and the room fell silent. Jason took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. The next few minutes would determine everything. The judge sat at his desk, adjusting his papers. He looked around the room, his gaze briefly meeting Jason's, then the officers before he spoke. After carefully considering the testimony of both parties and the circumstances surrounding the arrest of Mr. Jason Adams, the judge began, his voice steady, "I have come to my decision." Jason felt his heart race again. This was it. There was no turning back now. The judge had listened. He had taken his time to deliberate. Now Jason could only hope that his efforts had not been in vain. The officers involved in this incident did not follow proper protocol when handling Mr. Adams. While they may have believed they were acting in good faith, their actions were reckless and unjustified. Mr. Adams was wrongfully detained and arrested without reasonable cause. This behavior goes against the principles of fairness and justice that the law is meant to uphold. Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. The words he had been waiting for were finally here. The judge was siding with him. "As a result," the judge continued, "the charges against Mr. Adams are to be dropped, and the officers involved will face internal review and potential disciplinary action for their conduct." Jason blinked, the weight of the decision slowly sinking in. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step toward change. The officers would be held accountable. They couldn't get away with treating anyone like that again. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned." Jason stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to do next. His mind was still processing everything. He had won. The truth had prevailed, but there was so much more work to be done. The officers left the courtroom without a word, their faces still blank. Jason didn't bother to look at them. He wasn't interested in their reactions anymore. What mattered was that they had been held accountable. What mattered was that he had fought back. As Jason left the courthouse, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a start. A small victory, yes, but one that meant everything to him. He had stood up for what was right, and the judge had listened. And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt like he could breathe again. The days that followed the court decision were a whirlwind for Jason. The relief he had felt in that moment, when the judge handed down the ruling, gradually shifted into a quiet reflection. What had happened was more than just a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of standing up for yourself, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that might be. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the larger fight for justice, for fairness, for a future where no one had to face what he had. Jason spent the next few days speaking with reporters, sharing his story and answering questions. The news of the judge's decision spread quickly, and soon, people were reaching out to him from all over. Messages of support came in from both strangers and friends, and even the local community that had been quiet before was now buzzing with discussions about what had transpired. But while the attention was overwhelming, Jason couldn't help but feel a little disconnected from it all. This wasn't about the fame or the recognition. It was about something deeper. It was about the truth, about proving that there was more to the story than just the assumptions people had made. Jason's phone buzzed again as he sat on the porch of his apartment, his feet up on the railing, trying to enjoy the late afternoon sun. It was another message from his lawyer. "Let's meet tomorrow. We have some important updates." Jason frowned at the message. He had been hoping for a bit of a break, a chance to rest and let the events settle, but it seemed like that wasn't in the cards just yet. He texted back, "All right, I'll see you then." The next day, he met with his lawyer at a small cafe down the street. It was a quiet spot, not too busy, and Jason was grateful for the calm environment. His lawyer, Sarah, was already seated when he arrived, her notebook open in front of her, a cup of coffee in her hand. "Hey, Jason," she greeted him with a smile, offering a seat across from her. "I know you've been through a lot, but I have some news for you." Jason sat down, his curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee before answering. "I spoke to some folks from the city. They've been discussing your case, and it's created quite a bit of conversation about the way law enforcement handles situations like the one you faced." Jason raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean? Are they going to do something about it?" "They're considering a review of police protocols," Sarah said, her voice calm but serious. "Not just for the officers involved in your case, but for others who may be handling similar situations. There's a push to ensure that people aren't unjustly detained, especially when there's no real cause." Jason couldn't believe what he was hearing. The idea that his case might inspire real change, that his voice could be part of something larger than just his own experience, was something he hadn't fully processed. That's huge," he said slowly, still trying to absorb the magnitude of it all. "Do you think they'll actually make changes?" "It's hard to say for sure," Sarah replied. "But the conversation is definitely happening, and that's a start. We've already made a dent, Jason. People are talking about it, and that's what matters." Jason leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the table as he thought about everything that had transpired. He had gone from being a man wrongfully arrested to someone who might just be able to help create real change. He had always known that something needed to be done, but it was different now. He wasn't just talking about problems anymore, he was part of the solution. The conversation shifted to the future, to how Jason could continue to use his platform and his voice to advocate for fairness and justice. It wasn't easy, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, Jason felt like he was part of something that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Jason kept a low profile, choosing to spend time reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that the fight had taken on a different shape. He wasn't just fighting for his own rights anymore. He was fighting for others who had faced similar struggles and for those who might face them in the future. One afternoon, Jason received an invitation from a local community center to speak at an event about police reform. They had heard about his case and wanted him to share his story with a wider audience. Jason had been hesitant at first, but after some encouragement from friends and his lawyer, he agreed. He knew that this was another opportunity to use his voice for good. The day of the event arrived, and Jason found himself standing in front of a crowd of people, some familiar, many strangers. The room was full with people seated in rows of chairs, all waiting for him to speak. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jason could feel the weight of the moment. This was another step in his journey, but it wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had been wronged, the people who had suffered in silence for far too long. When it was his turn to speak, Jason stepped up to the podium. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces that looked up at him. Some looked hopeful, some uncertain, but all of them were there for one reason: they wanted change. Jason cleared his throat and began. "Thank you for having me here today. My name is Jason Adams, and not long ago, I was wrongfully arrested at a gas station. But today, I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what we can do to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again." The words came easily now. He had told his story so many times, but today felt different. It felt like the right moment to speak out, to share not just the pain of what had happened, but also the hope that change was possible. "I'm not the only one who's been treated unfairly," Jason continued. "And I'm not the only one who's had to fight for basic human rights. We have a system that's broken, but we also have the power to fix it. We have the power to demand accountability, to demand that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, be treated with dignity and respect." The room was silent as Jason spoke, the weight of his words settling over the audience. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Jason stood there, feeling the energy of the crowd lift him. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs too. It was the victory of every person who had ever felt powerless, every person who had ever been treated unjustly. After the event, Jason received messages from people all over, many sharing their own stories, their own struggles. It was humbling, but it also reminded him of why he was doing this. He wasn't in this fight alone. There were so many others who had been fighting for years, and now their voices were growing louder. As Jason returned home that evening, he sat down on the couch, his thoughts running through everything that had happened. He still couldn't believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. But what mattered now was that he had become a part of something bigger than himself. He had given a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. The fight for justice was far from over, but Jason knew that he had made a difference. His actions, his willingness to stand up and speak out, had shown others that they too could make a change. And that, he realized, was just the beginning.